Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to the Coaching in Higher Education webinar series. Today's webinar titled Embedding Coaching in Postgraduate Certificate in Higher Education. My name is Jelena Matic. I'm going to have to be admitting people in as I'm welcoming you all. My name is Jelena Matic, and I'm delighted to be your host for this session, where we'll be exploring how coaching can be more than just a helpful intervention. How can it be embedded at the heart of how we teach and what we teach? This webinar is brought to you by Coaching in Higher Education Network. We launched the network in November 2024, so we are very much new, and this is the second webinar in the series. The mission is to spotlight and share examples of coaching-informed educational practices. Apologies, I'm getting a little bit distracted with the lobby. So the mission is to spotlight and share examples of coaching-informed educational practices across the sector. Through sessions like this, we aim to connect practitioners and researchers who are using or exploring coaching in their work and to collectively drive the development of coaching-informed practice in higher education. So in higher education, we talk a lot about developing reflective practitioners, fostering inclusive teaching, and supporting staff and students to complex transitions. And coaching brings a powerful values-driven way of doing this. It brings a focus on way of thinking, relating, and growing that aligns with the challenges and opportunities of current higher education sector. Today's session will highlight a brilliant example of this in practice. So our speakers have redeveloped their postgraduate certificate to center coaching, not as a bolt-on or a scheme for a few, but as a foundational part of how participants experience the course and how they learn about coaching practice. We will hear how they use action learning sets, transformative learning theory, and some practical coaching tools to support real shifts in mindset and practice. I hope that this inspires ideas for you how you can embed coaching more deeply in your educational practice. And before we begin, just to note that your mics will be muted while the presentation is going, but once we move on to the Q&A section, which we will have enough time for at the end, I will make sure that you can use your mics and have a discussion with all of us. So I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers for today. We have Ian Coleman, who is a consultant coach and senior lecturer in academic development at the University of Lincoln. Ian has a 30-year career in higher education, elite sport as a coach and sports psychologist, and business. And it's recognized as an innovative facilitator of learning for groups and individuals. He now combines lecturing in higher education with private coaching that is characterized by high support and high challenge, enabling leaders to develop emotional intelligence and resilience, manage transitions, and maintain a work-life balance to support long-term effectiveness. Daniel Cole, or Dan, who is a teaching recognition lead at the Montfort University. Ian and Dan worked together at the Montfort University when they developed this program. Dan, as a teaching recognition lead at DMU, is responsible for leading DMU Professional Recognition Scheme, which awards Advanced HE Fellowship from Associate to Principal Fellow. Dan also leads on a variety of academic professional development initiatives whilst continuing to teach on postgraduate certificate in empowering education. Dan's research focuses on application of active learning and coaching practices in higher education, teaching learning environments. So I can tell that you're in a very good hands today, and I'm very excited to hear from both Dan and Ian. So it is over to you.
Thank you, Jelena. Something you said there, which is you said about coaching as a way of relating, and I'd go one step further and say coaching as a way of being. And it was very much thinking of coaching in that way, and coaching as a cultural practice that led us to when we reinvented the PGCert to realize that the PGCert itself would be an ideal way to increase exposure to coaching as a way of being, much more so than the kind of typical kind of coaching schemes that we have at university, which really have a limited reach. So we thought we would increase the reach of coaching by embedding it within a PG cert, because we've in a way got a captive audience. So that was very much the rationale for this piece of work that we're going to talk to you about today. And building on this idea, I thought, I mean, I don't really like definitions particularly, but I thought this would be a useful starting point. John Whitmore's definition of coaching as unlocking a person's potential to maximize their growth, which sounds very kind of performance-y and maximizing and all that. And I would change that slightly and define coaching as a way of unlocking a person's potential for learning. And I think if we expand coaching in that way, then that leads us into coaching as a learning practice, as a pedagogical practice. And that's where we're going with this, really. And I'll allow Dan now to sort of explain how we led into coaching as a pedagogical practice in our PG Cert.
Great, thanks, Ian, and welcome everyone. Thanks for the invite. So our PG Cert in Empowering Education, it's quite an ambitious program, in all honesty. And to give you a bit of institutional context as to why we decided to redesign our program, there are a few things which sort of influenced this. So first of all, obviously, the introduction of the new professional standards framework in 2023 meant that it's prime opportunity to redesign the program. But our institution was also transitioning through an Education 2030 strategy, which brought DMU towards a block-taught curriculum where we teach modules in 7-week blocks from start to finish. And we thought, well, actually, as a teacher training program, we should mirror this and try and demonstrate how we can embed effective teaching and planning strategies in our PG Cert as well. So we have 4 15-credit modules, and coaching conversations in learning and teaching is the 4th in the sequence. But as Ian said, it was really important to us to try and embed a coaching culture from the start of the program, to try and give our lecturers, our students who are new to teaching, a real firm sort of basis, a real firm foundation in applying non-directive coaching techniques to their teaching practice, and try to investigate really, well, how can this be scaled up? How can they use them as teachers, these effective coaching skills and techniques? So the 4 15-credit modules, as you can see up on the screen, range from the first one being more generally about effective higher education teaching and learning and pedagogical strategies, moving on to digitally enhanced learning and teaching approaches. The 3rd module was reimagining higher education, which looks at inequality, sustainable development, and more contextual issues across the sector. And then we finish the program focusing specifically on coaching conversations in learning and teaching. And we assess it in a variety of different ways, as many of you who I'm sure deliver on PG Certs do the same. We do include a teaching observation, but most importantly, in the context of this presentation, we have action learning sets throughout the program. And to give you a bit of flavour as to what that looks like, we try and embed at least 1, sometimes 2 action learning sets, depending on the schedule of the cohort per module. And action learning sets, we'll talk about them later for colleagues who aren't familiar. I'm sure most of you are. Really focus on developing questioning techniques and coaching skills within our students. And we see it as an ongoing way of developing, which is sort of absent of learning outcomes. There aren't specific criteria that we want to achieve, but we want to give our students the opportunity to develop skills and practices which we can later reflect on in the coaching conversations module. So specific learning outcomes, Ian, we developed these right at the start of the program, and you can see up on the screen the learning outcomes for module 4. Do you want to explain those in a bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my presentation wasn't keeping pace with yours. So hopefully we're all on slide number 6 here. The just to sort of add a little bit more to that. Coaching wouldn't be very embedded if it just consisted of one module. And so that was the reason for the action learning sets, and we'll come back to that. But yeah, the coaching module itself, we were very clear that in one 15-credit module, we were not going to produce coaches. And so, I mean, just not enough time and not enough depth. So hence the title, Coaching Conversations. We wanted to enable participants to have enough of an experience and enough tools to be able to facilitate safely coaching conversations. I was also absolutely determined when we designed this module. I didn't want to just teach people about coaching. We wanted people to have an experience of being coached. And so that happened both in the module and in the action learning sets. So it was a highly experiential module from the very beginning, with as little didactic teaching as possible. So although we weren't going to produce coaches, and we were going to try and enable people to facilitate coaching conversations, we did, I think, feel the need to provide some sort of framework and around ethics and the legalities of coaching. So there was that sort of aspect to it. We wanted them to be able to apply coaching tools. And the third learning outcome, I think, for me, was the most interesting. We were really asking a question in this third learning outcome. And we were saying, well, lots and lots of people are very interested in coaching. And people are interested in coaching in higher education. But usually the sort of default direction that people take coaching in is either postgraduate supervision, in brackets, one-on-one, or personal tutoring, in brackets, one-on-one. And the kind of elephant in the room for me was, what about the sort of introduction to psychology 101 that's in level 4 with 250 people in it, 250 learners? How do we do coaching there? And so that third learning outcome was how does coaching work in learning and teaching in its broadest sense? Student support and supervision. And then clearly there was a need for learners to engage critically with their own development, and that was that fourth learning outcome. And interestingly, and Dan will talk more about this later, the assessment here we decided had to be a professional conversation. It couldn't be an essay or anything else.
Go on.
I'm hoping this slide is moving on for all of you. Dan, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so in terms of approaches to teaching and learning, then we took a very specific approach, and because this is in relation or in response, I suppose, to our block delivery. So to give you a flavour of what our students are experiencing, they would come to us once a week. They'd block out an entire day, a Wednesday or a Thursday, depending on which cohort they're in. And during that entire day session, they would experience a morning session, an afternoon session. The morning session was more theoretical, but as Ian says, that we ensure that it's as active and participatory as possible. And you can see the schedule there, which I'm sure Ian will talk to in a minute. And then in the afternoon sessions, we based it more on using these skills and these concepts that we've spoken about in the morning to enable coaching practice with peers. Ian, do you just want to go through sort of the context of these sessions and then the overarching sort of view of the ALS as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting on the right, I mean, there's a really abbreviated sort of schedule of content for those morning sessions that Dan was mentioning. First, the question of what is coaching and how is it different from counselling? How is it different from teaching, or is it different from teaching? How is it different from mentoring, advising, etc.? So first asking that one, and then moving on to coaching in the context of adult learning, and there's quite a precedent there in Knowles's work and in Meseroff's transformational learning, which we'll talk about again in a little bit. And then we moved on to, well, the importance of managing relationships, the beginnings, the middles and endings, both in one-to-one and in group situations. And then lots of practical coaching and coach development work, enabling learners very early on to have some tools to pick up and use in those afternoon sessions. Now that's the sort of, for any of you who've done a level 5, you know, these would be probably fairly familiar bits of content from a coaching learning context. But what about these action learning sets? So running concurrently throughout the whole program, from beginning to end, we had these learning sets. So in a way, we were a bit cheeky because everybody was absolutely saying, no, this has got to be totally block delivery and all at once. So, but we had this long, thin sort of add-on around action learning sets. For those of you listening to this, action learning sets, coaching circles would be another way of thinking of these, or group coaching. And so we trained a number of facilitators to facilitate. They were very much facilitated action learning sets. And one of the, I don't know if it was a mistake, or one of the things that we did, certainly I did in facilitating these, is that I didn't explain why we had these these action learning sets. And so the participants really valued the experience of having a safe space where they could share an issue and sort of be coached in a group. They really valued it, but they didn't quite get why we were doing it. And it wasn't until about session number 4 or 5 when they suddenly thought, hang on a second, I get it now. We're coaching, aren't we? And we're coaching and we're being coached. And it's like, yes, exactly, that's what's it about. So that when they got to module 4, that wasn't the first time they were coaching or being coached. They'd been having this long developmental process where it all kind of came together in module 4. So that was a sort of the bit of sneakiness that we were applying. And I think probably as a response to feedback, Dan, in second iterations of the program, when I'd already moved on to Lincoln, I suspect you were giving people a heads up quite early on as to why we were doing action learning sets. Is that true? Is that what happened afterwards?
Yeah, that's right. And when we come to talk about the professional conversation for the assessment, it was based off feedback from that, because colleagues were saying, well, actually, we get the principles, we get the theory of coaching and the opportunities as to how we can apply coaching in teaching and learning, but we've not had a chance to do it. So when colleagues then sat back and realised, oh yes, we have done it in action learning sets, it's something we now get our students to do much sooner, and we get them to reflect in an ongoing sort of way, so that by the time it comes to the professional conversations, those colleagues can talk about how they've coached within the action learning sets as one of the examples of applying techniques.
Great. Yeah. And each afternoon, as Dan said, we would structure, semi-structure coaching practice, so that by the end of the module, they'd actually engaged in quite a few hours of coaching or being coached, which I think was important. And there are opportunities, I think, to potentially credit some of these hours if people then moved on into coaching qualifications, etc. But that's not something we've particularly explored yet. So it looks like it's me still talking on the next couple of slides, and I just wanted to briefly touch into Meseroff's transformative learning theory, because this was one of the theories that we used to try and make the connection between coaching and learning in higher education. And I know in a previous webinar, transformative learning has been mentioned. And so I thought it might be helpful to explain how we took this a little further and helped learners to make direct connections between this theory and teaching and coaching. So for those of you familiar or not, 4 key concepts, which I'll attempt to really sort of give you a really potted understanding of. So Mezirow talks about meaning perspectives. So this is very much our view of ourself in the world. So an assumption might be, for example, I'm not good at maths. As my view of the world is, I'm not good at maths, or people are a certain way. We have, based on that, attitudes and feelings. So presented with a maths question, I might get stressed, or I might behave to people. If people are, I behave to them in such a way that confirms my belief that people are. I hope that gives some understanding of what a habit of mind or a meaning scheme might be. Crucial to Mezirow's theory is this concept of being given the opportunity to critically reflect on these judgments, these attitudes that that emerge out of our view of the world. And then when we do that, we then find a disjunction between our previous view of the world and new information that we're presented with, which causes us to change our view of the world and act differently. And the key question is, how can coaching take us on this journey? The specific journey he talks about, there are 10 steps where classically we're presented with a disorienting dilemma. So for a student in higher education, that could be something simple as an assignment that causes us to be completely at sea. How on earth does this work? I don't get it. And then we're taken through a process of, well, what does this mean to me? How can I work through this? What can I understand? Can I explore different ways of approaching it? Okay, maybe I could do it this way. I could try out a new way of understanding myself in the world. Oh, that seems to work. I might feel more confident, therefore I can do it in a way. And I've just taken you through, a lightning journey through those 10 steps. And the only reason I'm mentioning this is because we spent a long session on this with learners, and they discovered that they can use different coaching approaches on each of these 10 steps. And it seemed to be a very useful way of taking a learning theory into a way of coaching in classroom situations. Maybe there'll be questions on this later on. That may have been too fast to make any sense at all. But nevertheless, this was one of the theories that we used in this coaching module. I'm going to let Dan talk about some of the tools and techniques he used in the more practical settings. Dan.
Hopefully you can all see the image now of some of the practical coaching sessions that we did based in our civil court, a lovely room to do active sessions like this. So just to remind you, we did more of the theoretical stuff in the morning, and then followed it up with practical teaching in the afternoon. And the key point of this, this was one of my theoretical sessions, but it was practicing coaching techniques and tools. So the idea of this is to really apply experiential learning. So yes, we could discuss specific methods such as using mind maps, and we'll share a couple of them in a second, or doing values elicitation and really looking at why students might make certain decisions and how we can enable those decisions and support them to make meaningful improvements to their practice. There's all kinds of things that we tried in the morning, and it really was about, let's have a go at these and let's see, well, what are the opportunities for us to use these tools and techniques within our teaching practice? Would they work with your students and wouldn't they? Really sort of enabling our students to critically evaluate whether they would be appropriate, whether they could be scaled up to be used with groups, or whether they would be used in sort of supervision or one-to-one opportunities. So a couple of them, and again for sort of trained coaches in the room, now a lot of these will be very familiar. Two of which, one, the blob tree or the jelly baby tree, which was extremely popular for some of our students. So the start of my coaching session, this was up on the screen, the image on the left-hand side, and I asked students to pick a jelly baby and tell me why they're described as this particular jelly baby. And we applied questioning techniques, open questions to try and investigate, well, how are you picturing yourself in this way? Which one would you want to be? You know, which one could you be in 5 or 6 weeks' time? And then we applied it to a typical student situation. So Ian used an obvious one there, you know, getting ready for an assignment. We've got an assignment at the end of our block in 6 weeks' time. How are you feeling right now before we commence this session? And then exploring why, you know, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? How can we change that perception? So really practical uses of these more professional sort of coaching techniques that colleagues may well be familiar in the room. And then the other one on the right-hand side, performance profiling, if you like. Ian, do you want to sort of explain your background in performance profiling and how it could be used in learning and teaching?
Can, Dan. I'm happy to, just briefly. I mean, so I'm pretty certain most of you will be familiar with this sort of wheel. It comes from Kelly's personal construct theory from the 1950s. So there's sort of a psychological basis to it. And the cool thing is that it's often used in life coaching, but you can use it in all sorts of ways. So if you completely ignore the words around the outside, you can present someone with this wheel with no words around the outside and ask them a question that could be, dependent on their role, you know, say, for example, they're an engineer, you know, what would be the 8 crucial characteristics of a successful engineer? And they go, oh, okay. And, you know, they write those around the outside and then they can self-assess. I've used it with program leaders, you know, what would be the 8 sort of key competencies of a program leader? And then they can self-assess against that. Of an educator in higher education, of a learner, of a biologist, of a designer. So it's hugely flexible and really a useful conversation starter because it gets that sort of self-assessment against a number of components. That's all I'll say on that. I'm sure people are familiar with that. So we can move on. Dan, you are the expert in professional conversations. So I'll let you talk about this one.
Well, it was interesting. We used this wheel in the lead up to the professional conversation, because one thing that we found when students became aware that the only assessment, 100% of the grade, is going to be a result of a conversation with an assessor, it created a lot of uncertainty amongst our students, a lot of worry, a lot of anxiety, you know, naturally, as you do when you have conversations, interviews, vivas, whatever people recognize these conversations as. So we use this wheel in preparation for this. So not only were we able to apply it within the program, but students could then see, well, actually, how can I use this with my students in the future when sort of preparing them for these potentially stressful, anxious moments? So around the outside, our students would plot things like, well, fairness in grading, that's something I'm particularly worried about and I'm unsure about. So how do I rate my current understanding of this out of 10 and so on? And how can I articulate verbally out of 10 and get them to really identify these key things which they want to do in preparation for the conversation and allow them to self-assess. We then use that to explore, well, what areas can we improve and how can we improve over the next week, so on and so forth. So it was a good way of actively demonstrating how a more traditional coaching tool can be used in a teaching and learning context. So we won't spend too long talking about the assessment because obviously we're focused more on the application of coaching techniques. But the assignment in this module, just to follow suit, is a professional conversation. Now, if there's any colleagues in the room who taught on or still do teach on the PGCEEE, the Level 7 APA, Academic Professional Apprenticeship, this was a mandatory assessment when we delivered it at DMU before. And again, something which we were relative novices at when we took this on, crikey, when was it? It must have been 5 years ago. And although there were certain things that we decided to remove from our revalidated PGCert and in higher education, one thing that remained was this assessment method. And it was wholeheartedly the thing that we received the most positive feedback from students on. So assessing 100% via a conversation with an assessor. So we decided to retain it for this module simply because it felt like an authentic assessment method. After having a whole module talking about, application and coaching conversations, we felt this would be a good way to finish the module and assess our students' understanding of coaching. Now, it's not a coaching conversation. That wouldn't really be appropriate for a summative assessment. So it's really important to ensure that we, first of all, sort of standardized our practice as reviewers and as assessors. And we did so by recording some of the initial conversations, marking them between each other. We shadowed each other when we were assessing, and we made sure that although they were natural conversations and assessors were confident to jump in and ask for areas of clarification, it wasn't coaching to the point where we would get the answers out of students if they didn't know the answer, right? So there did have to be a clear sort of boundary between a coaching conversation and a summative assessment. But just some things that we learned through our time. I go into a bit more depth in a paper that I published back in 2022. The link's at the bottom of the screen if colleagues are interested. There are some considerations if you feel like you'd want to bring this into your programme. Initially, we thought, should this be an option? So that should it be an optional conversation or written assessment? We decided to remove optionality, and we thought, well, actually, as an authentic assessment method, this is something we want to insist upon with our students. It might be a judgment call if you're going to bring it into your programs, and we recognise sort of inclusivity and the potential stress it puts on students. But hopefully, I'll give you a bit of confidence with that in a bit with some of the results that we saw. Something that made it work was the preparation for our students. We allow students to bring plans into their conversations, and we're quite instructional as to what those plans look like. We give an overarching template, but we kind of say to students, well, they can take the form, whatever form you want, but make them useful. So things that you can look at that you might not naturally remember, the things that you think will put you under stress in a live conversation, they're the things that go on your plans. We're not marking the plans. They're there as an aid memoir for you. But again, something that we found was really important was the terminology that we use when preparing our students for this conversation. We purposefully called it a professional conversation and not a viva or an interview or structured interview or anything like that. We called it a conversation. It was with someone who they're familiar with. So it was a teacher from the program, someone who they've met before. And all that did make a difference as to the level of comfort that students experience once the conversation got going. And it was really important that one of the things that we did standardise, and we continue to standardise as assessors, is how we approach questioning. So we utilise coaching techniques in how we phrase our questions. We just limit the amount of questions that we ask to ensure that it is a real, reliable assessment of student knowledge. As I said, the feedback is overwhelmingly positive. What we tended to see, and I'll sort of overview on the final slide, we tend to see, and this is feedback specific. We'll start now feedback in terms of the ALS. We asked students after the first couple of cohorts how they felt about action learning sets. So I don't know about you, Ian, but previously when we've done ALS in a less structured way, and by structured I mean timetabled in, so students kind of had to come, we would have attendance, which was some groups were great, some groups weren't. It would be inconsistent in terms of how effective action learning sets were. So having this structured, timetabled approach to ALS really seemed to help students. And the way it's articulated is that this is a teaching and learning approach, action learning sets. It's not a bolt-on, it's not like an additional support session. It's an alternative to teaching in the classroom. So 2 quotes from students up on the screen. I won't read them verbatim, but you can tell that colleagues are turning up, or students, sorry, I keep saying colleagues, students are turning up to action learning sets, developing a current problem that they're experiencing in their practice, in their personal life sometimes, but we sort of phrase it to ensure that it's boundary. And they're really finding opportunities to explore, well, how can I utilize my own creative thinking, but supported by effective questioning of my colleagues to delve into these problems and come up with workable solutions. And they usually allowed us to go into detail with things which wouldn't naturally come up in a structured session, a structured lecture. So 2 up on the screen, for example, how do we manage potential conflict or difficult situations with peers in our teams? Sometimes it was students that are coming with very specific personal issues in tutorials, and how do we manage these boundaries to ensure we're supporting students and not just signposting and passing them off. So real sort of contextual issues that colleagues chose themselves. So in essence, they're bringing to ALS what's really important to them at those times. So overall, the impact, we've done 3 cohorts now on the PGCert. We're moving into the 3rd year. In September will be the 3rd year of cohorts. And as I said, in terms of the assessment, what we tended to find from our students is that, yes, they started the module with potentially high assessment anxiety, but by the end of it, their satisfaction with not only the grades, but their satisfaction with the experience of the assessment was much higher than more sort of traditional assessments. And our assessment strategy is quite varied on the PGCert. So there are some written reports, but we do ask for blogs and we ask for screencasts, things like that. So it's the highest satisfaction in terms of the assessment method. 88% of the students assessed via this approach, 60% received very high grades, so between 60% or more. It had the lowest number of deferrals and extensions, which is a really important measure for us on a block program. It's something that we were worried about institutionally, out of all the other assessments, because it's live, it's done there, and students are prepared along the way, had the lowest number of deferrals or extensions. And from our point of view, although it's an intense experience assessing via a professional conversation, it's actually a pretty efficient use of time. We do the assessment there, it's up to an hour, the decisions are made there, and we're doing live moderation. So actually, the fact that there are less extensions, less resubmissions, it allows us to use our time effectively. But more importantly, related to the context in which we're all here for today, in terms of the long-term impact that it's had on our students as potential coaches, we've had students come to us saying, well, they've introduced action learning sets into their own programs as a teaching and learning strategy method. We've actually heard that colleagues have participated in and enabled ALS sessions within their faculties and their program teams for wider sort of academic development discussions to take place. We've had students enroll onto professional coaching qualifications, one of which is here today. Hello, Paul, really good to see you. And we also have students who have established one-to-one coaching programs with students, developing their own coaching academies within their students as sort of additional support opportunities. But probably most importantly, and it's not measurable, we are finding that students are leaving Module 4 and leaving the programme overall having adapted and included coaching practices and techniques as teachers. So we're seeing that they're evolving their teaching practice, and they are looking for opportunities as independent learners. Well, how can I apply these non-directive methods, these inquiry-based methods in my practice overall? So it's really exciting to see how these opportunities are going to flourish moving forwards. And I think that's it. Is there anything you wanted to add, Ian, from your experience on the programme?
Not really, Dan, but just, I mean, I totally agree with you that all those bullet points at the bottom are great, but it's that bottom one, that sort of slow burn, increased use of non-directive inquiry-based approaches, for me, takes us right back to what Jelena said at the beginning, which is, you know, his coaching as a way of relating, as a way of being, and that original thesis seems to be working to some extent in this. So it's good to hear that. Jelena's popped back up. We have gone a little over our talking time, but we've got a good solid 15 minutes. And I'd be interested to hear, I mean, we're talking coaching, so I'm not going to ask the closed question of any questions. because that's not a particularly helpful question. But I would be very interested to hear how that lands with you, what you take away from this, and any reflections you may have. So I'm going to sort of hand back to Yelena to facilitate this, and at your disposal.
Great, thank you both so much. I can hear the passion from both of you in terms of how well you work together on this and how much you want it to work. I have so many questions, but of course I can do that later, and I will allow our participants to go first. So Jamie, please go ahead.
Thanks, Elena. Thanks very much both for that presentation. It was really excellent. Thank you. I've also run a PGCert and an Embed program, and I trained as a life coach back in the early 2000s, and I've kind of embedded very similar practices, action learning sets, not calling it coaching and not talking about coaching. So I resonate with very much with what you've been talking about. I suppose my question often comes down to that question. I know you didn't want to talk too much about it, but assessment and that kind of process, and that inherent contradiction between if you're assessing and meeting certain criteria and you're giving a percentage grade at the end of that, which I think that, looking at your marking there, does that sit at odds with the kind of non-direct, the essence of what you're teaching? Do you have to directively teach something which is inherently a non-directive, that kind of open parameters? I'm just interested in how, if someone challenges a grade, how you respond to that in the context of a coaching approach to learning. Hopefully that's a very vague question, but
it's a difficult one. And yeah, I mean, Jay, I understand.
It's a fantastic question.
Yeah,
really,
it's the same issue when grading observations, I suppose, isn't it? And we still employ the pass or fail approach to observations, which we still don't like institutionally. I think Ian is exactly the same with this. I think we feel we have to have an observation in a teacher training program, but grading it is always something which feels difficult, doesn't it? And it's a similar situation with these conversations. I mean, it's we have to maintain a summative assessment. I think the way that we quality assured it through, we recorded all conversations, obviously with permission. We did a high proportion of standardization, and we shared it with our externals to assure ourselves of the grades. Because one thing you see when there's a high proportion of high outcomes is, well, actually, is this assessment too easy? But we did see a range as well, and we did actually see students who, for whatever reason, weren't able to attend sessions. There were a number of fails, unfortunately, and passes. So the range was quite big. It just happened to be that at the end there were a high number of high grades. And I suppose the way that we assured ourselves with the outcome there is that those rubrics that we use, the assessment criteria which differentiates between a fail, a pass, and then a distinction or the 60% or above, was very specifically looking at the criticality of evaluations, criticality of reflections, and yes, evidence informed, and that's why the notes are important, using researchers and that, but were they able to say, well, I applied this tool and this technique, this is what worked, this is what didn't, these are opportunities that I can see in the future, sort of looking at that overarching consideration of using that tool was the thing that really set people aside from just saying, oh, I used a jelly baby tree and it worked well, I can see how it works. So it's quite obvious to us the difference between those grades. But yeah, it's a difficult one.
And Jamie, it's a great question, but I would go one step further, you see. And I would, a sort of radical part of me would say that how can we even specify learning outcomes in a non-directive, learner-centered process, right? So I noticed Sally Bradley's on here, so I tip my hat to Phil Race and say, well, actually, what I would love to do is get all the learners in the room and say, right, you've all passed, folks, and the assessment's going to be about you demonstrating to me how you've passed. We didn't do that, but I salute the question. It's a great question, and there are contradictions which I get. And we've tried to find our way around them in the way that Dan has explained.
Thank you both for not avoiding the question. Jamie, did you want to add to that? Or?
It was just a final thing. Yeah, because in our Embed, we've got a final project, a 60 credit final project that the students design the assessment rubric and then of a project that they're then going to do. And that design of the assessment rubric is a really big part of the actual module. And it's trying to do that, trying to sidestep that kind of question of having.
I like that. Yeah. Right.
But I really would love to find out more, but I won't take any more of your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And you're right. You know, if you're talking about coaching mindset and coaching way of being, you will challenge some of the current HE settings and how we do things. Okay, so I'm inviting people to please ask questions while we have Dan and Ian here for another 10 minutes. Okay, there's a comment in a chat for Ian regarding the Phil race comment you made. Okay.
Wrong Sally.
Wrong Sally. Any other questions before I start asking my questions? But I can chat to Ian and Dan anytime, so please do ask your questions if this presentation inspired some thinking. While you're thinking, you can pose, oh, here we go. Indriani, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right.
Yes, you did. Thank you. It's an interesting kind of conversation you're building on, really. I'm kind of curious about, like, if you are thinking the approach of coaching in the context of undergraduate students, how would that look like? What are the kind of challenges we might actually face when we are taking that approach? Because, I mean, oftentimes what we found in the classroom is that it's more kind of a mentoring expectation. You know, so will it change, the model change, do you think, depending on the expectations in the classroom based on undergraduate and postgraduate students?
Yeah, I think that's why this is such an interesting network to be part of, Indrani, because we still see coaching as responding to individual needs and individual differences, which is very not easy, but it's much more straightforward when you're working one-to-one with students, isn't it? But as Ian said earlier, the context in which we work is often with large numbers of students. And when those students are level 4 students that are brand new to higher education, or international students that are joining the UK context, you know, all students have different needs. So I think one of the things we explore quite early on in the module is, well, what are the known definitions or descriptions of mentoring compared to coaching, and in which situations would we take more of a mentoring directive approach, but how actually can we scaffold students, and there's all these pedagogical terms which we're all familiar with, but how can we scaffold students through non-directive methods, through questioning effectively, so that they can become more independent and be more, I don't know, more comfortable with being coached. Now, the interesting thing for me is actually how can we scale this up? So rather than starting a lecture with a set of learning outcomes, can we start lectures with really deep and meaningful questions which students need to consider throughout their learning experience? Rather than it being lecture-led and didactic, can we have a model through which we're applying and planning questions, and we're getting students to develop autonomy so they can peer coach each other in those situations? Exploring those opportunities to scale up coaching, I think, is really interesting, and hopefully something we'll be able to investigate in the next few years.
And I think there's something in here about academic identity, and I think there's an opportunity for academics who have grown up being good at something, and educators have grown up assuming that they're the ones who either have the answers or should have the answers. And for me, coaching is a way of being where we say, actually, I don't have your answers. I may, at a push, find some answers for myself, but I'm selling us both short if I pretend that I have answers for you. And so I think, in very much along the lines of what Dan is saying, if we can shift identity to a way of being where I don't necessarily have the answers for you, and that is something that leans into, you know, rather than here's the content, here are the questions at any scale.
It's interesting. So we are kind of talking about, in a way, the mindset of the students and setting that expectation from the very beginning, because of course, you know, student coming to the university generally expecting, oh, well, I walk into the lecture and my lecturer is going to answer to any questions that I might have. And, you know, so it becomes easier for them. So then
in today's world, the one thing, if we're going to cultivate responsible citizens, I would argue that one of the central things we've got to do is help people make up their own minds and identify what is fact from what is fiction, and become critical about everything it is they're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and you can expand that out to any context you're thinking of. So yes, it is very much about mindset in running.
thank you.
Thank you for such a good question, and that is such an interesting conversation. Recently, I've been thinking about, for example, AI. That was such a good kind of opportunity to bring something into the classroom and say, I don't know what this is and how it's going to shape our subject, our industry, but let's figure it out together. Let's ask questions and that way learn together. And I know that that's kind of, you know, if we apply that to established subject and knowledge areas, it's challenging the norm and challenging what we currently do. But this is where Coaching Network is trying to push us to think how we can all act as learners, because we are always learning.
I think that's important, Yelena. I think it's not even an emergence of AI now, is it? It's well bedded within everyday life. But I think the accessibility of artificial intelligence means that our students can get answers. If they want answers and they want facts, they can get it at their fingertips. What they don't necessarily develop is the ability to ask AI the right questions and phrase them in the right way, and potentially look at the outputs of AI and question those outputs and critique the factual information provided to them. So again, through developing coaching approaches and autonomy with our students, they're developing those skills to hopefully utilize AI more effectively in the future.
Great comment. Thank you, Dan. There's quite a few comments in the chat. I'm going to say we have time for one last quick question if anyone wants to use the opportunity. If not, I'm going to ask my question. So I think it was quite a big shift that you did 3 years ago, and I was just interested in some of the challenges. Maybe this is not a quick question, but in terms of convincing the institution in this approach, what is it that you maybe had to do, or was it an easy win for you?
Oh, well, I think practicality, I'll do the practicalities, Ian, if you like. Practicalities are that because we were part of a block delivery program, 7 weeks from start to finish, actually developing coaching skills and techniques, that's a short period of time for our students to actually put it into practice. I think that's why we designed the afternoon sessions. But again, practicing coaching techniques and tools with a peer is very different to a student that might not be as responsive. So I think one of the challenges we saw is, although ALS was continuous throughout the whole program, could we find opportunities for students to practice coaching tools and techniques with their students earlier on? And it's something we're looking at now. I think it's also, we've kind of lit the fire with a lot of our students, and they've learned, well, coaching has so many applications within teaching and learning, but then the program finishes. So how can we continue to engage our students and develop them over the long term and look at these opportunities? I think that's a challenge that we're trying to address now.
I have to apologise. I'm not very good at multitasking, and I was responding to a question in the chat. I didn't get your question, Yelena. Was it about the challenge of getting this thing off the ground, or? Yes,
and especially because I guess it was something new and brave to do at that time. Did you have any pushback from the institution?
Actually, interestingly, we were quite lucky in that the director of the department we're working in was very keen to. In fact, he was a joint author on our publication around coaching culture, Alistair Blair, and there was a sort of a groundswell of interest in this. So actually, it was quite easy. We were lucky, and I mean, just a slightly off-piste funny story is we had to redesign the PGCert, And our first attempt at a redesign looked much more like a standard PGCert. And we were sent away saying, no, not innovative enough. And so then we thought, great, now we can really have a play. And so we came back with what we really wanted, which was this. So actually we were lucky in that we were swimming with the current in enough. So that was good.
That is so nice to hear. And I'm sure it's not going to be the case everywhere. So I would encourage colleagues to use this as an example to inspire those that are working with. I'm going to leave everyone in this webinar with a question I just posted in a chat, and that is, what might change in your own teaching or support practice if you approach it through a coaching mindset? Because that is something that I've been thinking through, and that's what this network is trying to do. All is left to do is to thank you, Ian and Dan, for your time today, for sharing the example of embedding coaching practice in learning and teaching, and for supporting the network as well in this mission to enhance learning and teaching through coaching practices. Thank you, everyone who joined the session today, and for your continued support, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing us together, Yelena.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time.
Thank
you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.